Damian Brown, thank you so much for finding the time in your very busy schedule to come on the Pin Drop podcast. This is the first time that we've met, although I feel like I know an awful lot about you, having followed a number of your challenges quite closely for reasons that I will go into in a moment. So to give a bit of background, because actually this really isn't a podcast certainly not for ocean rowers, not even necessarily for people who would already consider themselves to be adventurers. It's not an echo chamber of that kind. So you might well find that there are a number of people who don't necessarily know who you are and what you've done. So I'll give a short sort of introduction, but I'd love to hear in your words who you are and what's brought you to this moment in your life. So you were a professional rugby player for 16 years, is that correct?
That's correct.
In Ireland, although I think you played for Gloucester, is that right?
I played in Northampton. And
Northampton, sorry,
France
yes,
right. Well,
and France as well.
Yeah.
Fantastic. And then you became an adventurer. And now, amongst other things, you are also an international keynote speaker. You create incredible content to challenge other people to push their boundaries. You continue to be an athlete and take on different endeavors, expeditions, and we'll go into some of the detail on those in a moment. The thing that you are probably most known for is rowing the Atlantic both ways. One way wasn't enough. So you rowed in the Talisker whiskey race from La Gomera to Antigua. And then most recently, so you did that row solo, correct? And then most recently you rowed the other way from New York to Galway, which is quite an undertaking and quite an adventure. And hopefully you will tell us all about that. I think I'm right in saying you've also climbed 5 of the 7 8,000 meter summits.
5 of the 7 summits, yeah. So they're not
they're not all over 8,000. Okay.
No.
Okay. But you have also had an attempt at Everest, which was unfortunately thwarted due to a COVID outbreak at base camp. So you've had your own fair share of successes and what some might consider to be failures. I certainly don't. I think if you have a crack at anything, it's a huge success. So we've got lots to talk about, and I think lots in common. And actually, I first came across you, Damian, when I was preparing to do my Pacific row during lockdown, listening to your podcast Deep Roots, which I can highly recommend to anyone who enjoys listening to podcasts. And I derived a huge amount of inspiration, information, mental resolve from listening to that. I mean, we were in a situation where we were literally training in our living rooms on rowing machines. The gyms were closed. We didn't really have access to all the courses, the mandatory courses that, of course, you have to do in order to row an ocean. So trying to source information, also not being able to actually get time on our boat. So, we didn't even do an inversion test before we left. So I certainly distinctly remember listening to some of your recounts of capsizing on the Atlantic when you did the Talisker whiskey race, and writing down, squeeze your grip. Maybe you can go into what that actually meant. So thank you personally for all of that amazing content, because it really helped me. But even if you're not into ocean rowing, never have an ambition to row an ocean, I highly recommend anyone to listen to your podcast, just for that kind of understanding of what those types of things take, both mentally and physically. And it's an incredible account of that kind of challenge. But maybe, Damian, in your own words, tell the listeners kind of how you came to be at this stage in your life, all the sort of, I mean, it's a long story, but all the different ups and downs, the different challenges that you've undertaken, and how you came to obviously switch from playing rugby as a career to find a different gear in life.
Well, firstly, thanks very much for having me, and thanks for that incredible introduction. I don't know how I'm going to follow that. So yeah, I was lucky enough to come straight out of school, secondary school, into professional rugby. It was a time when there wasn't great depth in professional rugby, not like, nowadays where you would go into an academy system and all that. So
Mhm.
it was kind of fast tracked into senior rugby very early, and playing at kind of 19 at a senior professional level. So a formative time, a kind of steep learning curve in terms of professional rugby, and its learning curve and my learning curve within that, because professional rugby was only like 4 years old, 5 years old at that point.
Mm.
And then that journey was kind of reflective of me as a person. I'm very curious. And that journey in rugby itself was a kind of wandering, searching path. I played for 5 different clubs in the 3 major leagues in Europe. So 2 in Ireland, Connacht, Leinster, 1 in the UK with Northampton Saints, and then 2 in France. And that kind of was, just me constantly looking for an environment that I felt, was one that I was happy in, and kind of reflected and lived the standards I demanded of myself. Alongside just a curiosity to see different countries and live in different countries, and and experience their cultures. Even though Ireland and the United Kingdom have a huge amount in common, there's still quite a difference. So
Mm.
it was a very fruitful journey, in terms of life, and in terms of my internal world, through pushing myself physically and mentally, self-propelled, and also pressurized by, the environments, fellow players, coaches, strength and conditioning staff, uh, the environmental culture that was in each rugby club, the pressure of fans, the pressure to perform. So, I think of these things as crucibles. You're squeezed by that pressure all the time, and when you go through a professional rugby career, it's there for, like, in my case, 16 years. So, if you're able to survive in that squeeze under that pressure all the time, you build up some really, really
Mm.
uh, powerful tools, valuable tools. Um, so yeah, I was very keen. I was very clear and keen to continue that way of living, where I'm constantly exposed to a kind of more vulnerable, fragile side of myself, and embracing that and learning to deal with that, and through that embrace, through that learning, strengthening myself.
Mm.
So the path I saw to do that was in these adventures that I discovered while I was playing rugby. Things like the Mountain de Sable, things like climbing high altitude mountaineering, things like rowing oceans. I was the type of player who took huge responsibility for himself and his performance, and I didn't really need to be motivated. I didn't need to be pushed. I was very self-driven.
Yeah.
So I was always looking outside the sport to see what other people were doing in physical endeavors, physical pursuits, and how I could use that, or use some of what they were doing in their kind of specific sport, or a specific part of training for a sport, to be better. And that was like very wide ranging, from things like powerlifting for, absolute strength, to
Yeah.
bodybuilding for putting on lean muscle mass, to ultra endurance running and what they were doing kind of mentally to endure. Um,
And did you find that quite an easy transition then, in that sense? You kind of, because often sports people, as their careers inevitably end, will go through a period of readjustment. And, did you immediately know exactly which direction you wanted to go in?
I did, yeah, I was very
Mm.
clear. I knew from about 7 years before I actually ended up retiring that this is what I wanted to do next. Like, I didn't see it as a career as such. I just knew that there was some things that I really wanted to do with my life, to try and achieve, and I knew that they would be very fulfilling, because it was on that path, of that when you touch on that power, you know, that empowerment that you get from, you know, being able to control your state in extremes, it's very hard not to become, not to strive for more, like not to look for more from it, not to have some sort of what I would deem very healthy addiction, to be searching for more on that path. So this is the way I saw
I can definitely identify with that. Healthy addiction.
Yeah.
That's what I tell myself anyway.
Yeah. Well, you could be doing worse things with your life.
Absolutely. That's right.
So,
that's right.
I think when you're trying to, you know, bring more out of yourself and empower yourself, lift yourself up, I think that's a, you know, a very healthy thing to do. And people around you benefit as well. So, you know, from that self-development. So yeah, so that's kind of the pathway I saw into these adventures, and I just started about doing them, and the transition was relatively smooth. I know it's a struggle for a lot of people, and reasonably so. You know, it's a big hole left in your life that will never be filled, and that's what kind of helped. There's two things that helped me on that three things. So having this purposeful way of living, this purposeful way of life, that was a huge one, of course. Not identifying as a professional rugby player, you know, knowing myself, like knowing that I was much more, you know,
that
much
wasn't
more
your
than
identity.
that. No, it wasn't my identity. And what was the last thing I was going to touch on there? So I can't remember. It's gone blank. It'll come to me now in a second. But so just having those things coming out of rugby, you know, they helped me kind of make the transition quite smooth and quite painless, because I know it is very painful for some people. Oh, sorry, I got it. It was accepting that I would never fill that hole that a primal sport like rugby gives you. You know, it brings out you know, until you play that game, or like similarly kind of confrontational games, warrior sports like that, it's hard for you to understand the kind of the edges of life that brings you into, you know, and there I felt I missed them hugely, those moments. Like they're only split-second moments, but like moments of collision in rugby sports, or in rugby, that you know, I just had to kind of swallow and go, listen, unless you're going into a sport like MMA or, you know, something similarly kind of primal, you're not going to get that. And I didn't want to go into a sport like that. I had enough kind of, I didn't want to be punched in the face basically for the rest of my life. So,
unless it was by a wave.
yeah, exactly.
And how about the sort of the team element? Because interestingly, obviously went from, I mean, there were a few things in between, but you sort of went from professional rugby, where you're obviously playing as part of a team, into undertaking endeavours, which, of course, you never operate entirely in isolation of others, and you have a sort of a team of people around you, but you're essentially doing those things solo. Was that a conscious decision, or?
It kind of was, yeah. You know, especially when it came to you know, so if you're going to, the first thing I did was the Mountain de Sables. So you're kind of going to do that alone, or, you know, I was very much, in terms of at least preparation and that, it's quite a solitary thing, you know, long distance running. I know people, it doesn't have to be, but most on the kind of, it's a higher percentage solitary than not. But when it came to rowing, which was the next thing I did in ocean row, I was just conscious that, what am I trying to get out of these things? So there's a huge amount is going to come from it. What am I trying to learn? And I felt I knew the role of a teammate after 16 years in rugby, and I knew how to perform that role, and I was pretty proficient at it and confident in my ability to be a good teammate and sacrifice for the team. So I didn't feel I was going to get as much from kind of rowing in a team as I would by rowing on my own, and kind of that, you know, I know it's a one person show, but there is still a bit of what I would call self leadership in that. You know, you have absolutely full responsibility for
Yeah.
everything, like absolute in an ocean row for everything is your responsibility. So I just saw I getting more learning from the experience of doing it solo. So that's kind of where that conscious decision was made to do these things kind of solitary. And you know, fast forward a bit, and I'm sure we'll come back to some of that stuff, but just, you know, having done a solo row, then I was very clear, like, well, I don't want to do another solo row. So my second ocean row was as a kind of, well, it was a
It's
team,
not intended to be.
a team of two, but it ended up in more solo row than that. But
Of course.
my thinking was, well, what am I going to learn from doing another solo row compared to being the captain of a team? If you want a team of two, again, not a big team, but still, it's that role. I wanted to play that role under that stress and learn from it. So that's where my thinking came from around that.
So we have another thing in common, Damian, which is that we rowed in the same style of boat.
Good.
As I understand it. So now the main reason why we chose the Sea Sabre was because actually at that time no rannoch had successfully crossed the Pacific. So we actually thought it would be the safest, although we were acutely aware it would also be the hardest way to do the crossing. Now the Atlantic's slightly different, isn't it? At least going from La Gomera to Antigua, where you've got the trade winds kind of in your favor. Why did you choose to row in a Sea Sabre, which, just for our listeners' information, is kind of the most pure form of ocean rowing, right? So you have no auto helm, which means that you can't program your bearing. You have foot steering, and there's no advantage either with the build of the cabins. So on some ocean rowing boats, there's a wind advantage where one of the cabins actually acts like a sail. So some of those boats can really go incredibly fast if the wind is in your favor. I mean, the Atlantic is most commonly rowed in a rannoch boat, which is the easier option. Why? So tell me about your decision to do that.
Because I wanted it to be as hard as it could possibly be. That's my mindset around these things, and I'm not doing it to be easy. No, in a way, I don't really want it to be easy. Again, because I want to learn from the experience. I want to have to, dig deep and try and find parts of myself that aren't accessible in everyday life, but I know they're there. Like, so it's a kind of self-expression in a way, these kind of adventures, I know they're deep within me and I love to see them come out. So for that to happen, it has to be hard, and that whole mindset about will it be easier in a rannoch, or be easier in a what they call, I think it's called open class now or something.
Yes,
be easier. Yeah. Oh, why? I don't understand. Like, well, why would you want it to be easier? Like, so so that was a big thing. And the purity of doing it, like, by manpower alone, and standing on getting to the other side and having absolutely no questions. Like, nobody, particularly myself, but nobody can say, well, you had an auto helm,
you had some kind of advantage. Yeah.
You had it, or you had the winds, or, well, there was a certain point where, if you rode, you were going to slow down that boat, and I'm like,
yes.
I don't get it. I don't understand it, the mentality behind it. So I love that place. Like, when you get to the other side and you can bask in this rich contentment of knowing you did it as pure as you could do it. You did it to the kind of more traditional outlook, and you did it to the reason, or like a meaningful reason for you, so
and I mean, certainly from my own experience, getting through those times where you might be rowing at 0.6 knots or something like that. I mean, you could crawl faster than you're able to row, and yet you've got no choice. You have to just dig in and kind of keep going. And then, of course, other times you might be going a bit faster than that. Hopefully you would be, but that's when you really find out about yourself and what you're made of. And if you've got it in the tank, if you can, really find the resolve to keep pushing. And ultimately, I think the beauty of ocean rowing is that you are unsupported. So there's no alternative. There's no way off. There's no way out. Yeah, you can stop, but you'll go backwards. Which again is something that I'm interested in, because I have obviously not solo rowed. So the hardship of being on a solo row, which basically means that any time you're not rowing, you are kind of in the lap of the gods. You may end up going backwards. You may make progress as well, but you're not in control of that. So every time you have a sleep shift, you potentially will wake up and find that you've gone back. How did you deal with that over a period of time?
Yeah. So as you said, you're kind of at the mercy of the elements, and the southern on my first ocean row, so La Gomera to the Canary Islands, La Gomera to Antigua. We have the trade winds, so it'd be very rare for it to happen on that route. Now it did happen on day one for me, but it was more a case of the tides and the winds kind of changing, just trying to get away from land, and I got sucked back a bit. But where it particularly is prevalent is in the North Atlantic, west to east, so New York to Galway, because there's no consistent. Ocean rowing boats are the biggest factor of manipulating them is wind. So now in the North Atlantic, there's all these little microclimates, and the wind can be going one direction in one half of the day and a totally different direction the other half of the day. So the consistency isn't there like the lower Atlantic route, and I just got really unlucky as well this year with the weather. I faced a lot of headwinds, so I went backwards a lot. I think we calculated somewhere in the region of between 400 and 500 nautical miles backward over the whole.
So that was extra miles you didn't want to have to do or think you were going to have to do. That's the long way.
Miles, crushingly difficult, heartbreakingly difficult at times. The first half, when I got to halfway, it took me 44 days. The second half took me 68 days, and that was just because I just kept getting these headwinds. And
of course your fatigue is incrementally increasing, and
your capacities are dropping.
Yeah, it's taking a toll.
Yeah.
So let's talk about that row, because I mean, just phenomenal, Damian. How that ended, I want you to tell it in your words. But you set off with your friend Gussie. So the intention was to obviously row it as a 2. And what happened? Tell us how that played out.
So a bit like your row, that first week, 2 weeks coming out of in our case, Manhattan is treacherous. There's a lot going on, a lot that can go wrong. We have winds from the south blowing us north, and if anyone can picture kind of North America, particularly leaving New York, the land kind of Long Island and then Nantucket, and it kind of juts out kind of above where New York is, if you get me. So that's where we had the danger, I suppose, with those southerly winds to get pushed onto land.
Yeah, that would pull you in, right?
Yeah. And then you have tides and all, so there's a lot going on. Obviously, it's a very busy harbor as well. So, and then, of course, add to that, you have the physical adjustment of living in an environment you're habituated to living in an environment you're absolutely not habituated to. So there's a lot going on there.
Seasickness. And did you get seasick?
Yeah, bit of seasickness, sleep deprivation now because you're rowing in kind of 2-hour blocks, that sort of thing. So, there's a hell of a lot going on, and it can be very, it's a very difficult adaptation anyway. And you add in the fact that my mentality was from looking at the stats of, so there's only a 39% success rate on this route. So if you look into the stats of the failures, you'll see that about 80 to 85% of them go wrong in the first 9 days.
Right.
So my mentality was a bit like you talked about earlier. I don't care how slow the boat is going. If it's going forward, we're rowing. So I was very aggressive and very, I call it like non-accepting of the traditional thinking in ocean rowing that, you're going under a knot, put out the power anchor, rest up. it's not worth the energy.
Yeah.
As far as I was concerned, 24 hours rowing at half a knot is 12 miles. That 12 miles could be the difference between success and failure. We row. So I was very, like I said, very aggressive
And then
with
at
it.
least you also know that you've done everything that you could, right? You don't ever want to look
Absolutely.
back and think, oh, if only we
Yeah.
hadn't waited, if we had, you know.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. You know, and I'd rather be in control than kind of been
Yeah.
subservient to the
Yeah.
weather, like, and, you know, just sitting there waiting for something to happen. And, you know,
Mm.
nothing, really nothing good ever happens on an ocean row. So, in terms of, you know, so anyway, Gussie, he just really struggled with that first week, like, you know, because of all of those factors, physically and mentally. I
Yeah.
think it was, you know, it was his first ocean row. I think it was the realization of how hard it is was
Mm.
very, very difficult.
He'd also had recovered from paralysis, right? That was his
Yeah,
background,
yeah. So like
his
his
story.
story is an amazing story in itself, where he had a workplace accident in 2018, and it left him paralyzed from the waist down. Now, he had emergency surgery, and he came out of the surgery, and the surgeon said to him, you have 5% chance to ever recover any sensation below your belly button. And he went on to prove them all wrong. He went on this amazing journey where not only did he regain a sensation, but he regained proprioception and then mobility and then relearned to walk
Mm.
over the course of about a year. So it's an incredible story, and probably a bit of a blind spot for me was although he trained really hard and he put in all the hard yards for the role that I asked of him, was the fact that there's kind of an undercurrent of complexity to that, you know,
Yeah, that you're
an
not in
injury
control
like
of.
that.
Mm. Mm.
Yeah. And
Mm.
then the extremes of an ocean row and the extremes of the adaptation and the
Yeah.
extremes of the sleep deprivation in that first week, just, you know, it's
However,
just
I
too
mean,
much.
you know, knowing what it takes and the type of person it takes to row an ocean, you know, you want that kind of mentality on your team, right? So I can understand why you would you know,
Yeah.
be ready to row an ocean with someone who'd been told they'd be paralyzed for the rest of their lives and hadn't accepted that.
Yeah,
um
exactly. It does the values, right? The guy that
yeah,
the guy has
yeah.
exhibited through that journey, where you're like,
Mm.
well, I can clearly rely on this guy on the ocean.
Yes,
Like, you know,
exactly, exactly.
he's gonna work hard and he's gonna be determined and he's gonna be like tough and belligerent, and you know, they're all things
Mm.
that are needed.
Mm.
And stay positive as well, of course, because there's no way he would have went on that journey without having a you know, a level of positivity to
Mm.
make it happen. So yeah, unfortunately, on day kind of 12, then it just capitulated, where he went out. He was on that horrible shift, 3 a.m. to 6 a.m. We tried to do 3 hour blocks at night, so I would do midnight to 3, and he'd do 3 to give ourselves a little bit more of a sleep.
Mm. Mm.
And that's a graveyard shift, that 3 to 6, like.
Yeah.
And I came out. He gave me the 10-minute call, and then 3 minutes with 3 minutes to go, I came out. He was kind of splayed on the over the deck, like. And
Oh
there's,
my
you know,
God.
there's no place comfortable to lie
No.
on those decks. So if you're lying on them, something is jabbing into you somewhere, and it's, you
Yeah.
know, it's hurting you. So if you're doing it, you're in a bad way. And I was like, "Geez, everything okay?" And he says, "I don't want to alarm you, but I just measured my O2 saturation levels, and they're 86." And I was like, 86? That's, you know, clearly at sea level. And then he said, he told me this story about when he came out of surgery in the spinal unit in the hospital in Dublin. Um, he got rushed to ICU because his O2 sats dropped below 90, and apparently that's a massive indicator for blood clotting for
Oh my
people
God.
who have
Yeah.
spinal cord injuries. So the minute I heard that, I was like, oh, Jesus, like I mean, the penny drops for me, at least. I'm like, there's no way you can continue, like, now it wasn't my decision. I ended up with, land support. We got in contact with the doctor. The doctor made the call straight away when he heard his symptoms. So
Yeah.
that was just got into the Gulf Stream. We were about 550 miles from New York. So, and that was day 12. And then we had this whole kind of day trying to coordinate a rescue, evacuation even, and eventually got him away on a big tanker. Thankfully, it was a very, very, very calm day. And
I was going to say, I mean, I've obviously researched ocean evacuations, and they are often not pretty. Although quite often the reason why you'd need to be evacuated is because something's happened to your boat, which means the conditions wouldn't be good. But that was fortuitous that you had good conditions. But I imagine that was pretty scary.
It was,
and not only the sort of the evacuation itself, but the fact that you clearly decided to stay and to keep going, and so you're probably going through all those thoughts of can I do this on my own? What's in store for me? Can I deal with that? How did you deal with all of those thoughts and emotions and
all of those things? So once it was very emotional at the start because we put in a lot of work together, like 2.5 years, and we've been friends since we were kind of 18, 19. So,
right.
It was very sad and heartbreaking for him. He put a lot of time into it, but deep down, I still felt it was the right thing, like obviously, the reasoning was definitely right, like, because it was danger, but also it was coming. I just felt like it was coming at some point that he just was struggling so bad. Once we got him off the boat, I very much kind of, you hit on the points there. I was very much daunted by like the thought of what was ahead, and now knowing that the boat's not going to be going forward 24 hours a day, so it's 12 hours a day and this massive workload, just the thought of the work ahead.
And of course you'd done it before, so you knew exactly, well, different waters, but you knew how hard that was going to be.
Yeah, but and I knew it was going to be harder, right? Because of the weather conditions in the North Atlantic. So I knew there was going to be more going backwards. And I find when you're in those states of like, so daunting, so it's elicited through fear, right? And fear comes from the unknown. So my experience and strategy, if you want to deal with that, is always approach it and take the unknown out of it.
Lean in.
I'm worried about like something I don't know what it is, so I need to go and experience it and feel it, and then take all that worry, take all that dauntingness, take all that fear out of the experience. So that's what I did. I very much, like, I became actually quite cold in terms of internally towards Gussie. I was like, I need to get him off the boat now, because when you're in any sort of fearful state, your mind goes into these places, like fear corrupts, fear builds stories that are disturbing and unhelpful and destructive. It's a big manipulator, a negative manipulator of your mind. So
also, I'm guessing like an element of self-preservation, that you knew that he would be safe once he was evacuated, and you had to get on with the job in hand and keep yourself safe.
Yeah, absolutely.
So there's a sort of practicality that goes with that, where much as it must have been heart-wrenching to say goodbye to him, you've got to crack on and get on with it and keep moving.
I had a job to do, for want of a better expression. The great thing about ocean rowing, and the hard thing about ocean rowing, is not one bit of it's going to do it itself. You got to do the work. So so there was an element to that as well. Like, I just want to get going here now. And actually, we just got into the Gulf Stream, which is this big band of current, that runs up the east coast of North America and out into the middle of the Atlantic. So that's like a massive carrot on this. It's like the one thing you've got going for you positively, and it's a huge thing, because if you can get into the middle of it and stay into the middle of it, it's running at like 4 knots. So
wow, okay.
We just got into it 2 days. Day and a half before that, and we had a day that was very close to the world record, 109 miles in 24 hours.
Oh my God.
And so I was also conscious of, the fact that we're in this thing we've worked so hard to get into and search for the first 11 days. And now I want to make the most of it, because you can kind of get spat out of it, and it twists and turns. So it's very easy to come out of it, and now we're in it and it's a good day. We need to be rowing, and my mentality is always get across as fast as possible. I know it's very slow still. I don't want to spend a minute more than I have to on that boat. So that's my whole mentality. So yeah, it's very much a case of let's crack on, as you said.
Yeah. Well, and you certainly would have had enough food to keep you going.
Yeah.
Did that that must have also added weight though to, your solo endeavor to keep the boat moving? I mean, it's amazing how much the weight makes a difference.
Yeah.
We ended up offloading quite a lot of water, which we were a little bit nervous about doing because you obviously need it for ballast. But as soon as we did that, the boat was moving a lot quicker. So
really,
the weight has a huge bearing, doesn't it?
I nearly got to a point like in those first few days where I was like, should I just like dump a load of the actual food into the water? I decided not to, thankfully, because at that point I had the kind of 80 odd days in my head. Like I thought that'd be reasonable,
Yeah.
Little did I know it was going to take 112, and by the end,
then you were bloody glad you hadn't got rid of the food.
Very, very happy, yeah, because there's some stuff. I ended up having a really tough day on day 24 in a big storm where I capsized a load of times, and I lost my last jet boil. So the first one had malfunctioned, and the second one went during that capsize. So I was eating food cold then from day 24. And there was some food that was, for me at least, was inedible. Some of the
I'm not surprised.
Cold.
Yeah. Porridge is okay to eat cold. In fact, we did a couple of times.
The cereals, exactly.
Yeah, but you're not going to eat a blam hot pot cold. That's disgusting. I mean, a lot of it wouldn't even actually, mix up properly.
Yeah.
Oh my God.
So there
that's like the one luxury that you have that you can rely on, isn't it? Food, hot food.
Yeah. I know. And there was 3 meals that I just couldn't eat. So imagine if I had thrown out the ones that I could eat back then, I would have stitched myself up big time. So thankfully I didn't. And and by the end of it, so we actually really struggled, both of us, those first, well, for me, it actually ended up in about 40 days, but every day Gussie was on the boat as well, just to eat, it wasn't that we were like seasick puking. We were just struggling we had no appetite. So there was loads of food.
Well, I think I had the same, it's a stress response, I think. I mean, I had terrible seasick. I was seasick for 20 days. And then I had this thing that I didn't know what it was at the time. I just thought, why am I still being sick when I don't feel sick? But I had refeeding syndrome. So my body had been so accustomed to having so little in it that as soon as I started to have an appetite and eat, then it brought everything back up again. So I had 3 days of that, which was just my mental low, where I just thought, how can I carry on with this? Like I can't row on nothing. And I didn't miss a shift. In fact, that was the thing that made me feel better. To kind of focus. Right.
Yeah. Get out of that kind of.
Yeah. But I think there is also that stress response that just saps your appetite. And so you lose a lot of weight. Did you lose a lot of weight? Yeah.
I lost about 30 kilos.
Wow.
Start to finish. I reckon I actually lost like 90% of that in the first 40 days or so.
Yeah.
So I actually ended up regaining my appetite, after about day 45. But I remember catching a glimpse of myself in the reflection of one of the hatches and going, holy, because it was hot those first few weeks, so it was rowing.
Yeah, because you've got no mirrors. You haven't got a sense. I had exactly the same. So I lost 15 kilos by the end of the row. And I'm sure that I lost more than that at a certain point, because I then regained my appetite and was able to eat. But you have no way of really assessing. I just remember looking down at my legs on the deck and just thinking they don't look like my legs. It's such a bizarre thing, isn't it?
It's really, really strange. Yeah.
So fast forward a bit, and not to kind of skip over. You capsized a number of times. Obviously, you just told us you lost your 2 jet boils, which is pretty fundamental. But getting to the end of that row and towards Galway, tell us how it played out in the end, because this is the most phenomenal part of the story for me.
Yeah, so I found myself off the coast of Connemara, which is kind of where I was I was high enough, if you get me, in the North Atlantic to just row straight into where I wanted to get to. I was that far north. But then I had these big northwesterly winds for about 4 days. I had to go on power anchor for like 84 hours, and they blew me all the way down to kind of southern Ireland, a place called Kerry. And that was the first time seeing land. And I had a 30-hour window after coming off power anchor to make as far north as I could before I get these force 9 winds from the west blowing east. So they're blowing me onto land, you know, and now you're actually near something, right, that you can hit. So it's a danger.
Yeah.
So I had 30 hours of, as far as I was concerned, at least, just rowing and just row. And I cannot take a break because I got to get far enough north. Because it was this kind of peninsula called Dingle that jutted out off the west coast of Ireland that I was only at one point about 10 miles from. And if I wasn't far enough north, by the time these force 9 winds came, they were going to blow me onto land. So that was a huge push. And it was a real tread the line, risky kind of last few hours rowing in that, because of course the winds were mounting, right? Force 7, force 8.
Yeah.
And it's pitch black and I'm still not far enough north and I still haven't slept in about 20 odd hours. And I have these big big waves now generated by the winds on my right hand side. And I'm they're risking capsize in those conditions. And I've only 2 oars. And there's a very, very, very strong case that if I do get capsized, I'll break the oar. And if I break the oar, it's game over. But if I don't get far enough north, I get blown onto land. So it's a real stressful, tense few hours rowing through that. And thankfully, anyway, I got far enough north. I'm back on power anchor for like a day and a half. And then I could come off and actually had a decent kind of day then to get far enough north again to kind of for that last approach into Galway, which was held the last hurdle, at least as far as I was concerned, in the expedition, which was on the mouth of Galway Bay. There's a chain of 3 islands called the Aran Islands. And I had to get through them. And then I was in Galway Bay and then I was safe and then I had achieved what I wanted to achieve. At least that was my thinking and my belief. As we'll hear, it turned out a bit differently. But for once in this whole expedition, I actually had helping winds on that last day from the south. So these big southerly winds churned themselves up to kind of 30 knots that day. And I was going north, so they were pushing me up through the islands. So it turned out I had the most absolutely like exhilarating last day getting through those islands. So I went through this gap between the islands like Inisheer and Inishman. Like if you're looking at that gap straight on in a boat, you'd be like, it's not too bad, you know, we'll get through that, no problem. Okay, there's, you know, it's not bloody very wide, but still, you know, you get through it. But when you're in kind of 3, 4, 5 meter waves, 30 knot winds, and you got your back to it, and you've been rowing at this point now for probably, I think at that point I was about, I don't know, I'm going to say somewhere around 24 hours without sleep, trying to push forward, trying to get this thing finished, you know. So
and also your oars, which are your most prized possession, are sticking out the sides of the boat, and that's the thing that'll go first, and then you're really scuppered.
You're big, and like if people understand as well, when you're in shallow water, like so close to the coast, in heavy winds like that, you get the waves become really steep. So if you're in the middle of the Atlantic, they're big, huge, fat
swells,
rollers, and you just kind of go over the top of them. But when you're close to land, they're really dangerous because firstly they'll turn you sideways in the blink of an eye, and if you turn sideways in those, it takes a bit of strength and power and finesse to get out of that, and probably you risk capsize. So it was one of those heightened states of alertness, which are exhilarating, they're exciting, they're tense, they're nerve-wracking, you know. So it was all that in one, treading through those islands in those winds and waves. And of course, at this point, I had just seen people for the first time in 99 days.
Wow.
So you have that extra stimulus. There was boats coming out. There was ferries redirecting themselves. The Aran Islands are kind of tourist traps. So there's ferries
Yeah.
that come from two different parts of Galway Bay. So they came and circled around me, and there's a little plane that flies over to the Aran
Yeah.
Islands.
I
That's
remember
up,
seeing photos of you coming in and yeah, cheering you
brilliant.
on. Yeah, it's
Oh, it was
amazing.
incredible. Like, just so there was a lot going on. I suppose that's the picture I'm trying to paint, and I'm trying
Yeah.
to,
Yeah.
and I got through, and I'm in Galway Bay, and as far as I'm concerned, I'm safe. Everybody disappeared. I'm on my own again. I was getting blown, like these winds, of course, they were only amplifying in their strength, but still, now that I was through the islands, I was kind of blown me kind of north into the kind of more into the bay. So I was like, grand, fine. I took like about an hour just to kind of, let myself resettle after that incredible experience of treading the islands. Like, so, and I actually, the one of the boats that came out to me gave me a little goodie bag of like sweets and crisps.
Yeah.
And I've been eating cold food for 84 days at this point or
Suddenly you got
something.
some
So
Haribo and you were
exactly,
on
Haribo
fire.
and spicy nuts and all the things, I wanted. So yeah, so it took some time. I took about an hour, I think, and then I turned it. So now I have to turn the boat east, right, and row directly into Galway Bay. And about an hour into that, I took a couple of big waves over the side, and that's kind of when my heart dropped a little bit, and I was like, "Oh, this is not good." Like, it was starting to get dark. It was a no moon phase, and these winds were just amplifying, and these waves were getting bigger and bigger, and they were getting more dangerous to capsize. And I still had my plan was to kind of get inside a thing called Black Head, which is the headland on the southern side of the bay, and get some shelter for the night from those big winds that were pushing up from the south. But the more I rode, the more those winds pushed me north. So it kind of, every time I do an hour or 2 hours, I can't remember, and I go in, I'd look at the GPS because I had no perception of where I was on the bay because it was so dark.
So dark,
So I'd
yeah.
go in and I'd see I was blown quite significantly north. And I was like, fuck. So I'd come back out and I'd point the boat like south, well, not
Yeah.
directly south, but
Yeah.
southeast, and row that way. And then an hour later, I'd go in and I'd still be
You'd
further
be
north
pushed back.
because those
Yeah.
winds just kept pushing me. So like I had to try to capsize. So as the night went on, I had on my left hand side these big waves that were a danger to capsize. I'm going to break my oar, probably. And on the right now, I've got land and land approaching. So my head's on a swivel, left, right, left, right. It was unbelievably tense, like a few hours trying to evaluate all the information you had and reevaluate and trying to figure out, okay, well, I can't do what my original plan was. So what's the next plan? Okay, well, what kind of areas, what bays, what keys are on the north side of the bay? And is it possible for me to be able to kind of row close to them and be able to swing the boat round the key and try and get some shelter from these winds? Because these winds were like incredibly powerful. So yeah, you can imagine just pitch black, waves on my left, land on my right, and I'm getting closer to land all the time. So my head's on a swivel.
Presumably you're getting intel at this stage from land support. I know you work with Chris Martin, who I know, who we
Yeah.
actually leased our boat from and was quite instrumental in pulling our campaign together with us. So I know him well. But so you were obviously getting information through from them and some element of direction, I'm guessing.
Well, the last time I talked to Chris was when I got through the islands, and
Okay.
I never had an opportunity because, well, I probably could have had an opportunity at some point, but because I was in this kind of state that I actually enjoy being in, where you're taking in all the information and trying to make good calls. And I felt my plan was solid until I realized, it wasn't solid, like, which was, I mean, it was a plan we made together, right? Get inside Blackhead, and then
Yeah.
the plan was get in the lee of that big headland and put down the ground anchor for the night, rest there before doing the final row into Galway Bay the next day, because it's 26 miles from the islands into Galway Harbour, so I was just gonna split that into two and row in the next morning. There was kind of a big thing organized. So
Big welcome.
it got to a point where The Coast Guard was on the radio. The radio, they were reverse calling the radio. There was a guy shining a light in my eyes from the bloody mainland. I don't know what he was trying to achieve. He was just stressing me out
Not
even
helpful.
more. But I just couldn't get off the oars, like because I got pushed so close to land that if I took 15 seconds off the oars, I was going to be on the rocks, you know.
Oh
So I was constantly fighting to try and get away from the mainland, and it's pitch black, so perception is off, like it's not accurate. So I felt I was actually further out from where I knew there was rock outcrop along that northern shore of Galway Bay, but I wasn't, because I was, once my head was on a swivel, left, right, waves left, land right, and I looked around me at one point and I saw these two rocks jutting out, and I was like, fuck. So like it was a case of my only action was to try and swing the boat at 270 degrees. So fulcrum off one side, try to flick it round and punch out into these big breakers. And you know, that you have to like get the nose absolutely flush to get through any wave. So I actually punched through the first one. I was like, oh geez, I think I'm getting away here. And then the second one, I came in like nearly immediately later, and I was just showing a little bit of the front of the bow of the boat, and the wave just caught the side, and then it was so powerful, pushed me sideways and 180 capsized me, broke the oar, and then flipped back up. And I actually just instinctively grabbed the broken half of the oar out, because you know yourself, you can kind of bastardize those if you have enough time, like you can fix them. But of course I didn't. Like,
I'm not sure how you would have handled trying to fix your oar at the same time as dealing with everything else. Your adrenaline must have been through the roof. I mean,
yeah, big time. Yeah, but you know, it was.
You don't realize it at the time, I'm sure.
You don't. Yeah, no, you don't. And I mean, like 30 seconds later, I nearly immediately like realized that was futile. It was kind of just an instinct, and then I was sideways on in that surf, you know, in the wash of the surf, and I just kept getting pushed and pushed closer and closer into land, and eventually ground up on the rocks, and that was my what do you call it, unceremonious arrival on Galway.
So you then had to climb out of the boat onto the rocks, right? In your bare feet. Is that right?
Yeah.
I mean, Damian, I got off our boat after 60 days onto a jetty in Hawaii to be, you know, to literally kind of crumple in the arms of the people who were there to kind of greet us off the boat. I couldn't walk. I mean, barely. I can't imagine how on earth you had the physical strength, you know, the land legs, the capability. I mean, obviously you do what's in front, you do what you need to do with what's in front of you, right? It's just survival, okay? But it's such a phenomenal end to the story. I don't know how on earth you managed.
Well, I got a bit lucky, I think, in terms of like that, how far the boat ended up being washed up into the kind of closer to land, if you get me. Right. I didn't have to deal with any kind of water. It was basically straight. Once it got far enough, so God, it's terrible when you think, like, when I just remember going through it and just hearing the boat getting churned
the noise
by the rocks, sure. You know. But it got pushed far enough that it hit this big rock and that blocked it from going any further. And then there was the odd wash that was a bit more violent, and then it would shake the boat. And I was trying to make a decision on what to do, and I had a couple of those big shakes, and I was like, I need to get off this thing. So I put the sat phone in the bag, put the Began, my two phones, the project phone and my own personal phone, into a dry bag into my mouth, and slid down that big rock because it's full of seaweed, you know, so kind of got on it and slid down it. And same thing happened, just crumpled, like my legs, you know, didn't know when my legs were going to hit the ground, and then just crumpled. And I tried to stand up, but my legs really didn't have the strength or the, I didn't have the confidence to kind of ballast off one leg to walk onto the other foot, right? So it's pitch black now, of course. So I decided I can't walk, so I have to crawl. So I just crawled on all fours. And that's where my kind of had these water shoes on that ripped off, because they were on their last legs anyway. So they just tore off in the kind of rocks in
So,
the
so
water
you're
pools.
literally like shipwrecked, crawling
Kind of, yeah.
along the rocks. That's
I
quite,
saw a rock.
it's quite dramatic, Damian, really.
It was pretty dramatic, all right, yeah. Of course, you don't think that when, as you said, you're like just in kind of survival mode at that point.
Yeah.
And I realized that I wasn't sure if the EPIRB, so I had thrown it out just before I hit the rocks, but I wasn't sure if it had gone off. And I'd done the SOS on the radio again, just wasn't sure. So that's why I took all the phones with me, because I thought I'd have to ring somebody. So that's what I actually did. I crawled for about 15 meters. I saw this big rock that was in a bit of a drier space. Got there, sat on that, and then took out the big hand and made a phone call.
Is anyone there?
Yeah, I rang Chris
gosh.
actually.
Did you?
Chris, he was in bed.
He'd
come over. He'd come over to Galway for the finish, So he's like, oh Jesus, he was like, right. I was just like, you need to coordinate this, because I'm not sure if anyone knows I'm here. And then I rang another guy, Macdara, the manager of the project, because he only lives like 2 miles away, believe it or not. And I was like, have you got a high-powered torch, and have you got trainers? Because I'm on the rocks about 2 miles from your house. So,
oh my God. And they all came out.
Yeah, they all came, yeah. And so did the
search
guards
and rescue.
The police came as well. And
how amazing.
They
not quite not the welcoming committee that you'd expected, but still quite a dramatic one.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
I mean, honestly, the resilience and the adaptability and the presence of mind that you had to kind of do all of those things, to even just get off the boat itself, but to make sure that you'd taken your communications devices with you, and amazing, really amazing. But did you, and I remember reading this at the time, that you felt some element of that being a failure.
Yeah,
and having to kind of deal with that, which of course to anyone listening will think, oh my God, what an incredible thing. So how did you kind of come to terms with that? Because it obviously wasn't the ending that you'd anticipated.
I was gutted that night.
Oh, yeah.
Absolutely, like just gutted, and that was the reality of what I felt. I felt I'd failed. Like I'd come. Galway is literally 7 miles away, like where I wanted to get to, and here I am, 1 o'clock in the morning on the rocks. The boat, Kushla, who I had a great emotional attachment to, because she carried me through such crap, and she'd exhibited all the values I admire in somebody. So there was kind of an element of humanizing her. So, and she was getting churned up on the rock. So yeah, like I was able to come around to it eventually. Like, it's not to say that there was regrets for, so there was regrets for a space of time, maybe a week or two, but they lessened. They didn't hang around at the same level as such, and that was through conversation with people close to the project, like Macdara particularly, who it's hard to see the woods from the trees sometimes.
And of course you're exhausted and you're depleted, and you're not thinking straight, and all the emotional trauma of what you've been through. I mean, you probably had an element of PTSD from having kind of got through that experience.
All of that type of thing, the emotional attachment to the imagery that drove me for so long, getting thrown into Galway, and what that might look like, what that might feel like. So, the next day, the same day really, but like later that day, when we actually decided to, and this is something I'm so glad I did. So, there was a big kind of welcome home in the harbour, and there's about, I don't know, it was over 1,000 people came out to see me in. So it was, I really didn't want to do it. I was like, I don't want to go near it. Can we just tell them, like, and Everett Macdara particularly was, you sure? Like, because, this is, people are like, have become so engaged through what you've shared, and they're into it. They just want to welcome you home. They don't care if you're not rowing in, like. So I kind of saw it then a bit clearer, and I'm so glad I did it, so glad. So all we did was just went out in a rib, like 100 meters, 200 meters, and then and then came into the dock, you know, and kind of, I suppose, recreated what might have been a row in, like, but you know,
And you
everyone
still
was,
got the record, right?
yeah, well, I mean, yeah, I don't know if there's any record as such, but because it's not a pair or not a solo, but I'm still the first person to ever row from Galway to New York, like,
Yeah.
so
Well,
that's what,
there you go. That's the record in my book.
yeah, yeah. Um, yeah, and just, I mean, you got to experience that and what it meant to people. And, you know, this was a Tuesday morning. People had taken their kids out of school to come see me in. Like,
Yeah.
people had not gone
Yeah.
to work, you know, so it meant a lot to them. And I think that that's something that will only get richer for me, you know, those images and those feelings attached to them
Yeah. Yeah.
as I get older, you know, and I
Yeah.
see it kind of more for what it is.
Yeah, and the trauma fades and actually the good
Yeah.
memories stick. Yeah, I'm sure it will. I'm sure it will.
Mm.
It has for me anyway.
Yeah.
You know, we had some pretty big ups and downs, and it didn't necessarily end the way that I'd hoped or anticipated. But you know, you kind of process it, and I think everything happens for a reason. And some of the incredible experiences that you've had with that ending, which wasn't planned, will be, you know, fundamental to how you move forward and perhaps the next thing that you go on to do. And I mean, it's just really interesting to me, Damian, given everything that you've done, but also having heard a little bit about your general kind of approach to life. And, you know, you set yourself incredibly high standards. You find this deep intrinsic motivation for everything that you do. Where does that ultimately come from? Can you kind of pinpoint it to anything?
I mean, you could label it one of these things, and they're one and the same thing. I think it's life and death, right? It's making the most of your life or considering your death, or both things, you know, because it's we've got this finite window of time, and life has this great capacity to, if you respect it and go after it and reach into it and try and kind of squeeze every drop out of it you can, it gives you so much. And if you don't do it, it gives you so little. In fact, it makes it a fucking misery. So yeah, my learning has been on both sides of that. And now I'm very kind of aware on a very default level that you know, it's up to me to make the most of my life and to do things that are important to me and meaningful to me, and nobody's going to do it for me. And they're very authentic drivers for me. You know, that's just me being myself. So yeah, so it kind of comes from just trying to get the most out of myself, get the most out of life, realize my potential while I'm here, and have no regrets. Get to the end and go, but you know what? I fucking did my best, and I fought for every inch. And you have to fight in life. It's not going to give you anything unless you fight for it, you know. So I fought my corner, I did my best, and I made the most of the opportunity.
And not avoiding certain things just to stay in a state of comfort, right? So we have another thing in common, which is that neither of us are big fans of deep open water. So I had a near drowning incident when I was a child and basically avoided being in water for my whole adult life. You don't swim, you don't like being in water, am I right? My reason for doing the row, the Pacific row, was that I would then have to confront that in a really big way, and I could no longer avoid it. So tell me about your relationship with water, or how it is now, given that you've spent over 200 days of your life probably on the water.
Good question. Like I don't swim. Like I can swim maybe 15, 20 meters and then I sink very quickly, right? So it's not as if I absolutely don't swim. I suppose I haven't practiced in many, many years, and I would not be comfortable at all in out of my depths, you know, water. Like I'd be very uncomfortable. But I don't mind the water. Like I get into I bathe, I suppose, in cold water often if I can, you know. But yeah, that's not to say the first time, I will never forget the first time I was sitting on the edge of the boat. You know, I was all clipped in and all that. But
Mm.
talk about heart in your mouth when you're jumping
Yeah.
into the ocean off the side of a boat. Jesus,
Yeah.
I can only imagine what it was like for you, like with that confrontation of your fears. Like, but
Yeah.
even without that, it's like you're just thinking, what the hell is
What the hell
underneath?
is down there? How deep is it? Yeah.
Yeah. How deep
Yeah.
is it? Literally thousands of meters deep, like,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
you can if you're lucky, you can see about 3 of those meters, and you just can't help but think.
Yeah.
Again, it comes back to the unknown, like
I
what is in
remember
there.
at one point of our road receiving data information from some of our land support team to tell us that I think it was 11,000 meters we were above
Wow.
the seabed. I mean, that's like a lot more than Everest. I mean, it's just mind
Yeah,
blowing, isn't it? And you kind of have
yeah,
to switch your mind off to that stuff, I think.
you
Switch your
do.
brain off and just kind of keep moving forward, keep generating momentum.
Yeah,
Um,
it's one of those non-computable things, right? You're
yeah.
like, ah, it's too big to even think about, kind of like,
Yeah,
So,
right.
yeah.
Exactly. Um, as I said earlier, Damian, this podcast is really not necessarily for people who are already in adventure. Although I'm sure what we've discussed will massively appeal to anyone who is, but it's more to try and encourage people who see that they have more potential in them, but don't necessarily know where to start. So perhaps feel stuck in their
Mm.
situation, have the intention, the inclination. What advice would you give to somebody in that situation who's maybe kind of, as we all do, got used to more of a comfortable life, but is able to identify that there is huge value in pushing themselves out of comfort into discomfort,
Mm.
finding new edges in life? What advice would you give to someone on the beginning of their journey?
The best advice I can give is to you don't look to anyone. Look into yourself. Look into your heart. So we all have a head voice and we all have a heart voice. One of them is loud, chaotic, chattering, constant, and the other one is very, very faint,
Mm.
very hard to recognize, and very easy to ignore. And so many people do that, and that's very fair. How can you not get past this chatter that's
Mm.
all up here? But I know from experience, and my advice is, if you listen to the heart voice, if you can listen to it and make a connection with it and start to recognize it, and then trust it and take one
Yeah.
step into whatever it is saying to you. So that'll be different to us all, but that's the authentic part of us all. So, it'll point you in a different direction than it'll point me or somebody else, So it's making that connection and taking that first step by, how do we trust? We have to give somebody space. We have to give something space. We have to give it a chance. Like, so it's
Mm.
taking that kind of leap of faith, at least that one step. And then once you've taken that one step, it's strangely downhill from there. That's the hardest thing, the hardest part of the battle. And it's
Yeah, and
the,
I think that recognition, like you've described it so beautifully there, the heart voice and the head voice, and understanding that is what makes us human.
yeah,
It's normal, and
it's
we're all
absolutely
vulnerable to
normal.
it. So once you've accepted that, then you can choose which one to tune into at a given moment, and
Absolutely, yeah.
accept that the head voice might chirp up at times when you don't want it to, and that's okay as well. So you can choose to ignore it or not.
Yes.
That's a great way of putting it. I love it.
Yeah.
What's your Everest, Damian? Is it Everest? Where do you next want to take yourself
Then,
in adventure?
well, I mean, there's adventure in everything, right? So it doesn't
Yeah.
actually have to be a physical endeavor, and I think that's probably what's next for me. I will undoubtedly do something big and physical in the future. But now I think for the next year at least, or maybe year and a half, my something I've been thinking about for a long time and had aspirations to do, and have great respect for, is writing. So I want to write a book. I think that's something that's really important to me, and something I really want to put my heart and soul into, and try and express my journey to this point as well as I can. So I think it's quite a daunting adventure to be
Yeah, it's
forced
hard work.
into.
I'm on a similar journey myself, actually. Starting to work on a book, but yeah, it's hard work, but
Yeah,
hugely rewarding, I think.
I imagine so. Yeah, any bit of writing I ever do, and I'm just talking about very, online stuff. I find it quite draining. So the thought of doing a book is
Yeah. Yeah,
is
but I
quite a
think you've probably got the self-discipline and the the
yeah.
diligence to kind of do it. If there were three moments in your life, Damian, that you could go back to in the next 24 hours, if you could, what would they be?
If I could go back to experience them, or to change them, or to anything.
Well, I don't, that's up to you, I guess, if you would want to change them. But just, yeah, I guess I was thinking to experience them, just to go back there for a fleeting moment.
There is a moment when I was moment. It was about a month of endeavour when I was about 17. That I am incredibly grateful to myself for the decisions I made and the actions I took. And that was coming out of a rugby season, and not having played a game. And I took responsibility for the pain I was feeling. I took responsibility for what was making it painful, which was my kind of lack of fitness at the time. And I just started going up to my local rugby club at night time and running laps. And I'd
Mm.
love to watch from afar, over a couple of days, that young fella striving for more
Yeah,
from himself, pushing himself alone, totally alone every night, 30 nights straight, just huffing and puffing around that pitch. I'd love to get an image of that, and I'd love to even kind of whisper in his ear, like, just you're on the right path, But that's
amazing.
that's definitely one. There was a moment at the very end of my rugby career, um, playing for a small club in eastern France called Oyonnax in the top 14. And it was their first year. I just signed for them, and their first year ever in the top league in France. And we were playing Toulon, who had just won the Heineken Cup, and they had between them 657 international caps,
Oh my God.
mostly for France, South Africa, Australia, and the All Blacks. So, like, basically the four
Big
of the best.
units.
Big, amazing. Like, they ended up winning 3 European Cups in a row, and they just won it the year before. So they're the best team in Europe, and they were coming to Oyonnax, and we had one international who'd played for the Czech Republic, and he had 3
Not
caps.
renowned for their rugby prowess.
No, we had a small town of 20. I think there's 22,000 people in Oyonnax, and 15 of them used to come to the game. So the whole place was wedged to see this, like, Galacticos of rugby coming. And we were 5 points down with 10 minutes to go, and we just had our out half sin bin. So we were down to 14 men, and
Oh
we
my
ended
God.
up winning by 2 points. We scored a try
Wow. Oh
to
my
beat
God.
them with a man less. Like, just you just shouldn't win that game, really, like, and especially from that position, at least. So I just remember sitting in that change room afterwards, like, and I don't know if I ever felt such kind of contentment, because I felt I'd played well. The team had played well, obviously, and we'd beaten, like, a team we shouldn't have beaten. And there's something about that shared experience. Like, I've done lots
Yeah.
of solo things
Yeah.
first, but they don't compare to that shared experience. It's something very special. So
I'm sure you must have taken that moment consciously or subconsciously with you to the row. I mean, it just goes to show, doesn't it? It's not over till it's over, and you got to keep
yes,
keep fighting right to the last minute, right?
yeah,
Even
yeah.
if you end up on the rocks.
Even if you end up in the rocks, and I think, now that you lead into that, I think that would probably be my third one. Is,
Yeah.
when I came through the Aran Islands, I'd love another go at that, and I'd make some different. Like, I've reflected on it a lot, and I'd probably make a few different decisions. Maybe row into one of the islands and kind of get in the lee of that, and anchor down for the night, and try and ride out that storm that ended up pushing me onto the rocks.
But
But
well, a different day, you'd have different weather. You'd You'd never recreate the exact same condition. And that's the truth, isn't it? In life, you know, we don't, it's interesting to think, would you go back and change any of those memories? But we don't get to do that, right? So it's all about accepting and moving on and finding the next thing.
And learning
and learning. Yeah, exactly. And sharing your stories.
Absolutely.
What would you say are your worst habits, Damian?
Worst habits.
Or maybe I should ask Gus this question.
Yeah, maybe. Not great. I probably spend too much time on my phone. I'm sure so many people can say this nowadays, you know, but it's something that I am
sucks you in.
Becoming more conscious of. I'm obsessive. I mean, it works for some
it works
things.
Yeah.
I think it can be hard for some people to understand close to me, which I totally accept and I totally understand, you know. But it's the way I am, and I think that's it.
Okay. And my final question, I always ask this at the end of the podcast. What do you wish that I'd asked you? Is there anything we didn't discuss that you wish we had?
Maybe I'm very fascinated by the mental side of life generally, but particularly that's come through performance, right? So being able to control your mind in those states of stress, and I've really delved into that massively myself and kind of developed my own methods about, you know, controlling the mind in some of the most chaotic, stressful states you could ever experience, and the way that translates, if you kind of train yourself to do that, how that translates into kind of everyday life and your comfort in whatever comes at you, you know, because you've dealt with the worst of yourself, the worst of what kind of at least certain environments can throw at you, and you've built a very high level of self proficiency through that. So it all stems from in here, you know, and it's
relying on yourself. Strengthen yourself. Yeah, absolutely. And where would people go, Damian, if they wanted to read a bit more? I know you've got lots of online content. Just let people know where best to find you or that kind of information.
I think the best place with everything is damianbrown.com, and all my social medias are there. And most of the social media I'm kind of most active on is Instagram. Under the handle.
Well, you had a recent bit of success on TikTok, right?
I put up one video of myself sitting on the boat in a storm on the North Atlantic, and I got 3.9 million views on TikTok. Unbelievable stuff.
So the reason why that's on my radar is I've been told, I think like you need to get on TikTok, Vicky, and I'm like, oh my God, it's just another social media thing that I need to think about. I'm not into this. And you know, I'm the person with the pointless attempts on TikTok that get, you know, 0 views and a few likes here and there. And there you go with one post and you've got 3.9 million. That's kind of galling.
Most people,
so you need to share your hashtags with me, Damian.
Most people think I'm dead off the back of that, by the way. Half the comments are he never came out the back of that, or rest in peace. I'm like,
lost in the Atlantic.
Exactly.
Well, lucky for us, you did come back, and your story is well worth hearing. So I'd encourage anyone to go on and have a look at your website, look at your Instagram and follow you. And I'm excited to see where you go next, Damian. I hope we stay in touch, and it's been fantastic to talk to you. Thank you so much for your time.
Thanks, Vicky. Thanks for having me.
The Pin Drop podcast brings you the most intrepid chat on the podsphere. Interesting people sharing their personal formula for success, stories of personal growth, people confessing their fears and what they have learned from going to the edge. Hosted by me, Vicky Anstey, founder of We Are Intrepid.